Russia is resorting to that kind of indiscriminate violence against Ukrainian civilians, seemingly because the fight is having a devastating toll on its own troops. New reporting from the New York Times details how the increasing number of Russian troop deaths is severely impacting morale. The Pentagon estimates 7,000 Russian troops have been killed in the 3-week war so far, which is greater than the number of American troops killed over 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Between 14 and 21,000 Russian troops have been injured. American officials tell the Times those staggering numbers have implications on combat effectiveness.
Let me just say, while you're looking at those numbers, that's the conservative side of the estimate. That's a very conservative side of the estimate, according to officials that I've spoken with.
And, quote, the Pentagon officials say a 10% casualty rate, including dead and wounded, for a single unit renders it unable to carry out combat-related tasks. The report continues, quote, Pentagon officials say that a high and rising number of war dead can destroy the will to continue fighting. The result, they say, has shown up in intelligence reports that senior officials in the Biden administration read every day. One recent report focused on low morale among Russian troops and described soldiers just parking their vehicles and walking off into the woods. Western officials tell the Times around 20 Russian generals have been pushed closer to the front lines in an effort to boost morale. 3 of them are confirmed dead, and yesterday, Ukrainian officials said their forces killed a 4th.
Let's bring in one of the reporters of that story, senior writer at the New York Times, Eric Schmidt. Eric, there's so many things here that really stood out. First of all, let's put this in terms. Let's put this in context for our viewers. Over the past 20 days, more Russians have died in this war, if you believe the conservative estimates, than died. Than died over 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was one number that stood out. Another that stood out that somehow seemed even more striking. You wrote in the article that over 20 days, more people died in Ukraine than Marines died in Iwo Jima over like 35, 38 days. The tolls, just another way to put it, these tolls are absolutely staggering, aren't they?
They are stunning, Joe, and it just goes to the points you were making in your early report, just how ill-prepared the Russians were going into this fight, how they thought they were going to be able to roll into Ukraine with little resistance, take over the capital of Kyiv in a couple of days, the rest of the country in a week or so, and they've met fierce resistance on the ground from Ukrainians. And as you pointed out, these are, many of them are conscript troops who were not briefed on what was going to be happening to them when they got in. They've, in many reports, how they've been running out of fuel, running out of food on the ground. And it's not just the soldiers, the everyday soldiers on the ground, but as you said, this extends up through the senior ranks of the officers on the ground. As you pointed out, as many as 4 Russian generals killed in just these 3 weeks, which is an amazing number. It's very rare you would ever see an American senior officer like that killed in battle. So I think all these things add up, again, to underscore some of the real difficulties the Russians are having in these initial weeks of the invasion.
So, Eric, one thing I learned from the article that I found to be fascinating, and I'd like you to get into it a little bit more for people watching. You talked about how Pentagon officials you spoke with said that once you hit a 10% casualty rate, your effectiveness in carrying out combat tasks suddenly just drop off a cliff. Can you get into that a little bit more? Because the Russians, if you look at these numbers, even on the conservative side, then multiply out what that means for those injured on the battlefield, they're bumping up against that 10%.
That's right. So we're looking at units. These are tank units. These are armored columns that are going in. So if you have a small unit, say just a tank unit, and 1 or 2 people get injured or killed in that unit, that tank is no longer able to be, an effective weapon on the battlefield. And so if you just kind of multiply that out just at the small unit level, that can have a devastating effect. You work your way up, and suddenly some of the larger units aren't able to pull together some of the smaller units, and they can't fight effectively over a larger space. And that's what we're seeing in this campaign right now. While the Russians have made some progress in the south, they remain stalled in the northern pushes down into the major cities of Ukraine, including the capital of Kyiv. So this combat effectiveness is something that the Pentagon officials are watching very closely as we enter this critical phase of the next week to 10 days.
Radio Free Europe reports that according to local residents, Russian soldiers killed in battle in Ukraine are filling up morgues in Belarus. The number of bodies was unbelievably large. People at the city of Mazir station were simply shocked by the number of bodies being put on the train, one resident said. Local residents also say morgues in other cities in the country are full as well. Again, this must be not just impacting the morale and the Russian troops overall, Joe, but Vladimir Putin did not expect, not in the least, that he would be at this point.
Well, I don't think, he didn't. You've started to see some things going on in Russia that you would expect in an authoritarian state. Suddenly, people running security services are being arrested. Putin striking out.
A speech yesterday that was quite something.
Striking out at disloyal Russians. I'm curious, Eric, based on your talks, your reporting with military officials and reporting for this story, I guess the question that I have, or most anybody has, is how does a force this besieged, how do they encircle Kyiv? How do they even go into Kyiv? As I believe it was noted in your story, they haven't even gotten to the tough part of the fighting yet. And when they go into cities, they're just, General said, we considered a 10-to-1 ratio necessary for going into urban combat. It just doesn't seem, looking at your reporting, it doesn't seem like they have the numbers that encircle Kyiv and then go in and fight a battle to take that city over.
Certainly not with the numbers that we've seen so far, Joe, in these terms of casualty figures. So I think what we may be seeing instead is what we've seen in some of these other cities, including the ones you mentioned in your earlier report. That is, the Russians basically do the best they can, surround a city as much as they can, even if it's not completely, and then just start shelling indiscriminately, and using artillery shells, long-range missiles, and just to pummel the citizens of these cities into submission. I think at least that's the strategy right now Vladimir Putin appears to be pursuing. He appears to be doubling down, and that's what's really scary, I think, of this, is really the lack of any concern over the civilian deaths that are involved in this. And so whether or not they actually go into this city, which would be even a bloodier battle, I think we're in for some very grim days ahead as they continue to pound these key Ukrainian cities.
Yeah, and finally, Eric, let me just ask you briefly, just because of the fog of war. I've been skeptical early on of reports that show the Ukrainians doing extraordinarily well because of the fog of war, and also because we often seek out stories that of course, we want to believe. In this case, though, the 7,000 seems to be a pretty hard estimate. If you could explain to our viewers how the Pentagon came up with that. You got into it to the story, but talk about how they're making their estimates, so they're not listening to the Ukrainians, who are probably exaggerating on one side, and the Russians, who are understating it on the other.
It's a combination of factors, as you mentioned. It's looking at what's available on social media, what's available in the official, both Ukrainian and Russian reports that are coming out of their governments. But then the military is also looking at the damage to individual, say, Russian tanks. They know how many Russian soldiers are in a tank or in a personnel carrier, and if they can actually measure that number, they can start to extrapolate. But to be sure, these numbers are inexact. Casualty figures are always very kind of squishy, and so the Pentagon, while they're looking at these numbers and shocked really by what they see, they're also very cautious and continue to remind that the Russian military over time has proved to be quite resilient as well. If you look at Syria, certainly if you go back all the way to the battles of World War II and the tremendous losses the Russian military and the Russian public took. So they're not counting the Russians out at all in this fact, because they do have superior firepower. But the longer this goes on, the more you can see at least some benefits here for the Ukrainians, as we saw yesterday with President Zelensky's appeal as more weapons keep pouring in, they'll be able to keep this fight going on.
Wow. Eric Schmidt of the New York Times, thank you for your reporting along with your colleagues on this incredible story.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.